My shop does a lot of work on live edge and custom wood projects. So as a result, I thought I'd make a video to showcase just a whole bunch of different ideas of stuff we could do using something as simple as a log. What we're going to do is go from rustic, which means that basically nothing's been done to a log, all the way to something that's more polished. In this case here, it's about as rustic as you could get. This is actually a log from the backyard that I just split, and right away did the laser engraving. So one question I get from a lot of customers is, how tall of a log can you do? I can do up to 13 inches. It depends on what you want to do. So for instance, this log here would actually fit no problem inside of this industrial laser behind me here. So what we do is take a look at me laser engraving the very top surface of a solid log. And what you see here are growth rings. You see one is darker, one is lighter. The darker one is actually more dense than the lighter one. It's just depending on the seasonal growth patterns of the tree itself or the branch, depending on what we're engraving. Now, the way the laser works is that it doesn't have a two-way feedback system, meaning that it uses the same laser power whether it's going over the dark parts or the light parts. There's no way to know something is being hit that's more dense or less dense. How this affects the project is that no matter how much we polish this, even if I sand it with 1000 grit sandpaper and everything's nice and smooth and absolutely perfect, the laser doesn't care or doesn't know. So when you go over the darker parts, which are the higher density woods or the ring, what happens is that you end up going a little bit higher than what you want, because it takes more energy to go down deeper. Now when you go over the lighter parts, you end up going deeper. So you end up with a little bit of a step like this. Now we can do some things to sort of mitigate that a little bit, but not very much, because again, it's a natural product. always has growth rings, whether it's here or here, that affects what we produce with the laser. As you can see here, the growth rings now are going this way just because they're going through the wood. And you can see there's a bit of a variation in the height. That's why you see those lines going across. So it's not a default it's not a problem with the laser. It's not a problem with the design. That's just the way natural wood actually works when it's laser engraved. Now, the way the laser works is based on focus. So if it's higher up than the focus point or lower down than the focus point, we end up sometimes with charring or a little bit of a darker result. If it's right on, then it's going to be a little bit lighter. Again, it has to do with the resin content of the wood. It has to do with the variation from the focus. Because what you have to remember is with a laser, it's not a beam going down. It's actually a cone. So here's the focus point. A little bit burning, a little bit burning. Dead on. Now this issue with growth patterns also affects projects as you saw when we do a splinter. Basically a splinter is a log like this that's been cut or split across this way. Now again, we're focusing right now on the rustic sort of look and the rustic results. Now what happens when you have a piece of wood with varying densities both across the wood and with the growth patterns? Well, you end up with something that starts to get a little bit crooked. Now again, focusing on the laser, the focus point here, let's say, would be right here. But if you look across here, you can see the profile is anything but totally flat. And that's why you get the variations that you do, that you see on our projects. Now what we'll do now, we'll take a look at making something like this, but sideways. So this actually comes from this. It's just a side profile and not as thick. with all natural products, there is some natural variation in the results. So this here would be a ring that's basically unsanded, unfinished. In here you can see the result sanded and finished. You'll notice it's relatively flat compared to the bottom part here, which is not. So again, if you want a rustic look, we go with this. If you want something more polished, we'll go with this. Now here are two different rings from basically the same tree, same branch. And you can see there's some variation. So when our customers tell us, they want something that's roughly, 4 or 5 inches round. Round is a relative term. So do you want it 3 inches this way, 3 inches that way? Now a lot of that depends as well on the design. In this case here, the design was optimized. Basically this is an ornament. So you can see I tried to center it as much as possible, but you'll never have a perfect center. Because the material you're dealing with has a lot of variation, and the edges qualities and all these other kind of things. So for instance here you can see there's bark here and there's still bark here, it's just the angle of the branch is a bit different. Now we can move on to slabs. This here is a relatively large slab, but it's not a massive slab like I'll show you later on. Now even this one here has issues, I guess, and that's why a lot of people like the natural wood and some people just don't. For instance, here we have bark. Some customers like the bark, some customers don't like the bark. Here you can see there's a little bit of a defect, so to speak, here, but if you flip it around, you'll notice a far larger one. So we can engrave either side or even both sides. But it's something to keep in mind. In this case here it's basswood and it's relatively clean. There's no knots or anything on the surface of it. But sometimes our customers say, well, we love knots and we want a lot of knots. Well, then we'll source wood that has a lot of knots. So that's something to keep in mind. Going back to the material density, whenever there's a knot, that's very high density, which means that when the laser goes over it, it doesn't get a lot of depth. What you'll notice is that this is roughly 3/4 of an inch, or roughly what, 18 millimeters. But these can be had at various thicknesses. We can also make them in-house. So if you want something, a custom slab, let's say that's 2.5 inches thick, or you want something that's a little bit thinner, just let us know and we can make it for you. Now, a lot of the wood that we use is kiln dried, so that's something to keep in mind regarding seasonability. Not all wood is available all year. So there is some variation just in that area as well. We do have an industrial bandsaw. So cutting the wood, let's say for this here, you say, well, you know, I really love this log. It's sentimental to me. It means something to me. We can just cut it with the bandsaw to produce something like this. The nice thing about massive slabs that you have to keep in mind is that because they're so thick, they're less prone to warping. So let's say you wanted something like this here that was roughly 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, but you wanted it to be 1/4 inch thick. That's definitely not a good idea. And again, it's because of the variability of the wood that's built into it by the growth rings. What's going to happen is that over time it's going to start to warp. So let's say you have something for an anniversary or corporate present or something like that. You want as thick a slab as you can sort of afford and that fits with your design aspects. Generally speaking, the larger the slab that we use for our customers, the more they seem to migrate towards walnut versus, let's say, something like this that is basswood. Basswood's really good because it's a very consistent result. It's relatively lightweight. If this was walnut, it'd probably weigh about 3 times heavier. Walnut is a denser wood, so that means your production costs also go up. So not only do you pay more for wood, but you also pay more to laser engrave the design that you have onto that wood, because it has more density, which means that we need to go slower or use more power to produce a similar result that we would, for instance, with basswood. customers who say, well, you know, I really like the darkness of this, but I'd like it to be a lot darker. There's a few ways to achieve that. One is to engrave over and over and over again, and what that does is produce sort of like a charcoaly color, but that's very much dependent on the wood itself. If the wood has very little resin in it and is relatively light, it's very hard to achieve a dark look over something, let's say walnut, that has a lot of resin and a lot of density. So what we're doing with the laser basically is creating charcoal by going over it out of focus. Because we're a custom fabrication shop as well, we can also do custom assemblies like this here. So in this case here, it's an iPad holder or whatever kind of holder that you want. It's just two pieces of live edge, as you can see here. And we just routed out a hole to create the assembly that you see here. Now for the resolution that we can achieve on the surface, generally what we do is around 600 dpi, which is still overkill, but I find that it produces a nice sharp result on most woods. We can also do the edges, as you've seen here. So any surface on the wood we can actually engrave using our laser, or we can machine to your specs depending on what you want to achieve. So if you're looking for custom live edge or solid wood products, contact me at CNCKing.com.